Hello and welcome, everybody. I think we will get underway. My name is Kelsey Mullen, and I'm the Director of Education for the Providence Preservation Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the last event of our 2020 Providence Symposium this afternoon. Before we get too far into our program, I do want to acknowledge that the Providence Preservation Society works upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Narragansett Nation. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous people, and PPS's commitment to building respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. Now, many of you have been joining us for the 7 other programs we've held over the last 10 days, so you know how this symposium came about. We've really spent the last year or more thinking about preservation's role in social justice in the wider world and in our home in Providence here. It's never been more important to reflect on the places that have historically been prioritized and to really think hard about what we could be doing better. We've taken an interdisciplinary approach, coming at this question of whose places matter from perspectives of climate and housing and transportation, popular culture, and reflective diversity, and it has pointed us in some interesting directions. The Providence Symposium will be wrapping up after today, and it is a biennial program, so you won't see something like this until the fall of 2022, but we do hope to continue this conversation in ways big and small, so please do stay tuned and keep an eye on our events calendar. This is just one moment in a rolling conversation that is more and more critical every day. We also want to thank our many generous sponsors who've made this symposium possible. And in particular, this session has been sponsored by AIA Rhode Island. And it is incredibly validating to have their support specifically for this session, which is asking what we want for Providence. We are also grateful to our partners in preservation, both those that are specifically supporting this program and those that support us year-round. Now, you will recognize today's speaker, hopefully. Brent Runyon is the Executive Director of the Providence Preservation Society, where he's been at the helm for the last 7+ years. He is involved in many ways throughout our community and has been really thoughtful about shifting our organization into becoming a 21st century organization. He has been leading some of our conversations over the course of the symposium, as well as sitting back and just listening. And today, he and I are going to chat a little bit about sort of what he's taking away from our conversations over the last 10 days and where we might be headed moving forward. He'll be speaking, or we'll be in dialogue for 25-30 minutes or so, but we do want to leave a good, healthy portion of today's program for audience discussion and questions, the things that the symposium has raised for you, what you want for Providence, and how PPS can be an agent of change in that way. So, Brent, I will invite you to the virtual stage here and ask you to unmute.
Thanks, Kelsey. How are you?
Well, thanks. We made it. And of course, we're all, programming now in virtual land on Zoom, but this has been quite the undertaking. We do appreciate everyone's patience and graciousness as we've navigated how to do a multi-part program on Zoom, but I know it's taken a lot out of the staff, and we've all sort of been clenching for the last week and a half. But Brent, I'm curious.
Well, before we start, Kelsey,
of course,
I have to say it's probably taken more out of you because you finished a 5-week historic window restoration training program and then immediately dove into symposium. So kudos to you for juggling all of that and getting it done. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. It's easier when you're able to do it from your couch with a dog on your lap. So
that's absolutely right.
So thinking back on the last 7 sessions that we've held, I'm curious, what themes did you hear coming out of those presentations?
Well, I think you mentioned quite a few of them in your introduction, and by no means did I come up with anything original because of the way you curated the program. But I think one thing I thought was interesting is that no matter where we thought people were coming from, what we thought their perspective would be, there seemed to be a pretty consistent thread around, I would say, the fact that preservation is still leaning on its origins, which is really around the interest of white people and often people of some means, as far as who is involved in preservation, what are we deciding to preserve. And so there was quite an emphasis on that needing to change, but also being in the process of changing. So that was one thing, the diversification of the preservation field. And then those are obviously the people who are doing preservation. The other thing was the fact that we need to do better at diversifying the things that we preserve, the stories that we tell. Even one thing which I had sort of been thinking about, thanks to Marissa Brown speaking at our annual meeting earlier this year, but preserving things that no longer exist, which for those of us trained in historic preservation is hard to get our heads around. But for people who come at it from history or social justice or anthropology or public humanities, that's something that I think comes more naturally. So that theme came up a lot, preserving more diverse places associated with more diverse stories. And so that to me is really kind of something I've been thinking about a lot. And then I think a third big theme that I heard throughout the symposium, even the person who was talking about, very technical kind of why pedestrians are endangered and in today's cities and places, is this theme of preservationists often being the gatekeepers to certain kinds of advocacy and change, and that if we're going to be effective going forward, we really need to cede power to sort of non-traditional preservationists, people who are caring about their community but coming at it from a different direction. And so really letting it be a co-led, co-developed, really grassroots effort as far as how we think about what we're preserving and who's involved.
Those were definitely topics that I was hearing over and over again. I'm curious, those are some of the through lines maybe in the conversation, but was there anything that sort of stopped you in your tracks that made you think differently about something?
I mean, this isn't a big idea that was new to me, but the session yesterday where we had was about climate change, climate justice. And one of the speakers was Monica Huertas, who lives in Providence in Washington Park, and who I knew through social media. She ran for, I think she ran for city council. And I knew of her as an environmental activist, but seeing her on the call with her family around and talking about, just how personal it was for her, and all the work that had been done with the racial and equity, what was it, REJC?
Racial and environmental justice. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I went on their website later and watched some of their videos, and it kind of blew me away and stopped me in my tracks that there was this amazing effort happening and I didn't really know anything about it in what is a pretty small community. And the fact that there should be more interaction between our organization and what they're doing, because we talk about some of the things they're doing, but they're actually doing them. And so that was something that gave me a lot of pause and also inspiration.
Terrific. Climate, I think, is something that Rachel in her remarks yesterday contextualized as something that preservationists don't always think about, or there's not necessarily a strong connection in people's minds between environmental justice and preservation. And we've heard from folks, design professionals, advocates working in environmental and mobility justice, social media visionaries, political scientists. I'm curious, how do these voices from other fields or adjacent fields help inform the identity and work of a 21st century preservation organization? How are you making sense of all of this?
Sure. Well, so I've been in preservation for about 15 years, I think. And I can say probably 90% of the executive directors of preservation organizations are either trained preservationists or architectural history or something related, or fundraisers. So I think that having people from other fields involved in the conversation is incredibly helpful. And I've said this at other places, that since I've been in Providence and have been working with people at the Center for Public Humanities at Brown, my own thinking about my work has evolved. And so I think that, that says a lot. So for us to hear from experts in other fields and work with them, it can be taxing because we only have so much bandwidth. There are only so many hours in the day. And, so I think the symposium and bringing people in to have them speak directly to us and to think about that, I think preservation is a broad field already. It's not just architectural history and architectural preservation. So it's good for that to inform our thinking. I think the challenge is then what do we do with that knowledge? And so that's a constant struggle for me because I'm always planning. So it's like, but for just for everyone's benefit here, Rachel and Kelsey and I already talked about a month ago about spring programming around the issue of climate change and sea level rise. So I think some of the things we heard yesterday will definitely influence the way we go about planning for that and programming for that. So I think that's probably the key, is injecting these ideas more and more into our programming, and hopefully that will influence our advocacy and how we do that kind of work as well.
Yeah, I hope folks weren't too sort of shaken or disappointed by the fact there were very few sort of straightforward preservationists as part of this symposium. We really, in our headline speakers, there was not a master's degree in historic preservation among them, and that was intentional, but may not have been what you were expecting if you've attended some of our past symposia. And I know certainly reading widely, trying to absorb the expertise from our colleagues in other fields is where some of my ideas come from. And I hope that can extend to the organization as well.
Yeah, well, and you do a great job of that. And I think it's fortunate for us, you came from the Newport Restoration Foundation and had a lot of expertise in preservation already. But I will say I see Susan West Montgomery is on the Zoom today, and for many years she was in charge of the National Trust conference, which became Pass Forward, and they really are the ones that I first saw breaking out of the traditional thing about having just preservationists talk to preservationists. They were bringing in all kinds of speakers from different fields who are very inspiring. So I think we are not doing anything brand new, but I think we're doing it really well for a small organization.
Need lots of color on our plate to get the most balanced meal. So you mentioned, these ideas coming from disparate places hopefully informs the work that PPS and other preservation entities are doing. So what is next for PPS? How are you thinking about incorporating some of what we've heard and looking ahead at whatever time frame feels manageable to talk about? That can be, the next year, 3 years, 5 years, 50 years from now. How do you see PPS moving forward from this moment?
That's a really good question. I think it's fortunate that we began a strategic planning process just a couple months ago, and this is such prime content to inform our thinking about that process. So I think, in the, medium term or maybe short term, is that we do a better job of diversifying our board and volunteers, and really working on projects that matter more than just for their architectural interest or their historical interest. That perhaps we look at, our advocacy is around things that involve historical resources, but also have climate justice issues or sea level rise issues, or what are some, like the urban planning, the one about pedestrian safety. I mean, we already do advocacy around planning and design, so that's not a stretch, but I think like we've done becoming a partner with the Providence Streets Coalition, I think there are other partnerships that we can engage in, both where we can contribute knowledge, but also learn and not be a gatekeeper to a certain set of knowledge, but really support others in their work. So it's a little vague, I know, but I think it's both. I know the board wants us to focus on some kind of project following our strategic planning process. So I think hopefully that project will be informed by the content that we've heard here. But then more broadly and in a more vague sense, is just our day-to-day work. I think it will be greatly influenced by some of the things here. And I think part of it too is just when we take a position at a zoning meeting, thinking more broadly than just the design of whatever is being proposed, but more of the impacts that we may not, because of our backgrounds and our training, be able to think through, but having some inkling that, oh wait, there might be some other impacts that we need to explore more before we take a position on something. So yeah, what next for PPS is always a big question, but as with most nonprofits, and especially preservation nonprofits, we do not turn the ship quickly. It is an ocean liner and it takes a while to turn it.
You mentioned at the top, one of the themes that you were hearing throughout many of the presentations was this notion around ceding power, sharing authority. What could that look like for PPS?
So yesterday, or maybe it was this morning, it's been a long day, I spoke with Rachel and we were talking about the programming for the spring around climate issues. And I said, the way that the REJC did things was really bottom up. And I said, what if we, instead of devising programming and saying, hey, do you want to be involved? What if we said, hey, we would love to collaborate with you on designing the programming and figuring out who would be speaking and, welcoming in voices that may not have a master's degree in anything, but have real lived experiences. So I think that is something that I could see happening immediately. So as far as inviting people in, the other thing has already happened a few months ago, we were going to take a position to preserve, for a zoning change to preserve a church, turning into two apartments. And after hearing from the community about their concerns about gentrification and displacement and other issues around interactions with the police and things like that, there's some real visceral fears around what would happen if this place were developed in a certain way, but not in another way. And so that led to us rethinking how to take a position and really more engagement and listening to the people who have different experiences and different knowledge about place than we do. So I think that kind of engagement will continue, the listening, and that, because we have to know that we don't have all the knowledge that we need.
That's an important point. And I think PPS is in an interesting position that, of course, other organizations are as well, where we put our sort of political identity a bit more forward than some other nonprofits specifically. We make decisions and recommendations and throw our advocacy weight behind issues that have real political ramifications. And I think we're aware of that a lot of the time. Whereas many other nonprofits can be timid around taking a stance on something because it invites the politicization or controversy around that topic. How do you see, maybe you can dig a little bit deeper, that interplay between using our voice and advocating and being a force for good, while also allowing enough time to reflect on the issue that we're making sure that our voice isn't harming someone else or another community, or inadvertently, leading to an outcome that could be bad for other people.
Yeah, well, and I don't know that we'll ever avoid someone being disparately impacted by something that we do. I think as we saw or heard throughout the election season, just because you think there is a community that has a perspective and maybe another segment of the community that has a different perspective, that's not necessarily true. One segment of the community is actually, they may have 20 different perspectives. And that actually happened with that church. There was actually a third perspective that were people from the neighborhood who wanted to move back to the neighborhood, but there was nowhere for them to move to. So they wanted new apartments. So it was, I think what we have to do is approach everything with an earnest interest in listening to the different viewpoints and being very proactive about reaching out to people we know, and keeping track of who in each community has varying perspectives that you need to hear from is a challenge. But I think just being very intentional and earnest about wanting to inject equity and justice into our decisions, rather than just ensure that we're standing up for historic preservation. I think that's the only way we can do it. If we approach it from a justice and equity desire, then I think that will sort of drive our processes. And hopefully because we'll be thinking about, well, what are the impacts from those two perspectives? And so, that it's difficult, and it's made more difficult because we don't have volunteer staff or board members who represent all the segments of our city. It's a very white board. It's an all white staff, mostly white volunteer base. And so that's something that we, to really do better, we have to have knowledge at the table to say, well, hey, PPS, I'm part of your organization. I know you're thinking about this issue. Here's a perspective you should know or hear about. And I think we have to have people at the table that can offer those perspectives and help us know who to reach out to if we're seeking some opinion on the impact. So it's a process for sure, and a challenge. And I think it starts with having the right people at the table.
This is sort of an extension of that line of thinking, but what is the Providence Preservation Society's role in helping to build healthier, more equitable communities and ensuring that we are valuing everyone's history and everyone's places?
Mm-hmm. What is our role? Yeah, I think it's preservation organizations are strange beasts. You mentioned our advocacy role, but we also interface a lot with historians, which is often, they're typically organizations that do not take positions. And then on the other end of the spectrum, where, like I said, we're collaborating with the Streets Coalition, which is very much an advocacy group. So we're sort of bridging that. And so I think, one of our roles is to help bring history out of the archives through programming, marking. We do have a house marker program, and a downtown marker program, but different ways of recognition than perhaps we've done in the past. I think that's one way we can help tell other people's stories. But the other thing, when you mentioned what's our role in ensuring, equitable, I don't know, I'll say equitable, resilient, sustainable place. I think our core values have always led us to hope that our actions would result in those kinds of places, because we we do believe that people thrive in places that are beautiful, well-designed, and well-planned, and are safe and, you know, healthy and things like that. So those, you know, but it's a question about how far does that extend and where do we direct our energies? Typically, we're directing them in a few places. Often that's where people are yelling the loudest that they need help. Or we might say that, well, there are recognized historic places there, buildings, streetscapes, districts, landscapes. And we think, well, there's a designated historic place, so our voice should be involved in any proposal that involves redesigning that place or adding a new building or something like that. So, but if places aren't designated historic, then we often just say, well, our hands are full. No one's clamoring for us to get involved. So we're not going to. So I think, you know, that's an issue. If you look at a map of Providence and what places are historically designated, you'll see that that's where most of our energies are directed. And that leaves out a lot of the frontline communities and the fight against, you know, or fight for climate justice, environmental justice, and social justice.
And as somebody's pointed out in the comments, we've seen many sort of map overlays of Providence in the last number of days, and the official map doesn't represent anything south of the hospitals. So we're not even, when we look at a map, we're not even necessarily seeing all of Providence, which is maybe step one. Make sure that we are always referencing a map that includes the entire city. Yeah,
I think different parts of the city have been written off at various times, and often the very industrial areas are kind of written off because people don't live there. But as we saw yesterday, they live nearby, and what happens in those places impacts their lives, their health and livelihood. So that's a really good point.
So this is something of
map.
a leading question, and I know we have a few of our board members on the call. But you mentioned that the organization is in the midst of strategic planning right now. And our current mission statement focuses on advocating for historic preservation. That's sort of the first part of the mission statement, and the enhancement of the unique character of the city through thoughtful design and planning. So we've got preservation, design, and planning in there. As we head into strategic planning, do you, as the director, think that there might be a place for tweaking our mission statement to put people right there in the center of what we do?
I would not be surprised. The conversations we're having this year are vastly different from the conversations we had back in 2014 and 2015 when we were doing that strategic plan. And we did tweak the mission statement at that time, but I don't think significantly. So, you know, I would not be surprised if our mission statement changed pretty drastically next year. Once we've finished our strategic planning process, which includes the board and staff going through anti-racism training. And so there are a lot of moving parts. We'll still be in COVID lockdown to a great extent in the early part of next year. And it seems like people will still be, people always have been, I mean, people and pets, but mostly people have always been the number one concern for all of us as people. But I think for organizations, the needs are so great and so exacerbated, some of the issues, and I don't see that changing too much in the near future. So I definitely hope that preservationists around the country are looking at themselves like we are and working to make a change in how we talk about what we do and what we want to do.
So this is my last question before we open it up for dialogue with everybody else on this call, but it's a big one. What do you want for Providence?
That's a really big question. what do I want for Providence? I want everybody to have a job that pays well and has health insurance. You know, I think Providence is such a beautiful place architecturally, and has wonderful neighborhoods, not all of which get the resources that they need. But I think the biggest, you know, Providence, like a lot of post-industrial cities, doesn't have the economic base that we need to really support everyone here. And it's going to be, that growth is probably going to be bottom up. We have so many immigrants and people moving here from other places with a lot of energy and ideas. So I think that the economy is going to grow from that direction rather than some silver bullet like getting Amazon downtown. So that's one thing. The other thing I wish is that, or I hope for, is that our waterfront and rivers continue to get cleaner and more usable, because as we've seen, anytime you get people near the water, it's a good thing, and water draws people, and we need more waterfront activities.
Right, those are two good places to start. Now I think we'd like to open the conversation to more of you. You're welcome to turn your video on if you'd like to join us so we can see your faces. I'll pull from the questions that we have in the chat here to start with. Brent, could you give us sort of an update on how that circumstance with the church ended up? Where does it stand now? What outcome are we looking at?
Well, they did get their zoning approval, and I've spoken to the developers, and they did make some changes to the project to incorporate more community use, but I think there were still some unresolved and kind of angsty issues between a portion of the neighborhood and the developers. So I believe there is ongoing conversation, and also with the councilwoman. But I think it is moving forward.
Thank you for the update.
So I will say, maybe people are wondering, they originally had, I think, 11 apartments, and they decided to take it back to 8, I think, and then the sanctuary would remain a room where community activities could happen. So from the broader neighborhood. So hopefully that will be a good thing.
All right. If you do have questions, you're welcome to drop those into the chat or to raise your hand and ask them with your voice. That would be fine too.
Is that Barbara? Barbara, did you raise your hand? No? Okay. You always have good questions.
Got another question from the chat here, Brent. Doris writes that she was really engaged by Coop's presentation and his discussion of mid-century modern in largely Black and Latinx neighborhoods, and how sort of knowing your hood, sharing the enthusiasm for where you live is really important in lifting up those places and sharing the expertise and love and knowledge that already are embedded in those places. How do you imagine PPS addressing this approach here in Providence, where we don't always celebrate every neighborhood equally?
Yeah, and Rachel Robinson, our director of preservation, initiated PVD 25 to get us thinking about places in every one of Providence's 25 neighborhoods that should be celebrated. So that's mostly been rolling out over Instagram. I hope you're following us on Instagram. But we are talking about how next year we can make a more concerted effort to think about how are we going to promote resources in every neighborhood. So I don't really have the answer yet, but I would love to involve some people like Coop, who maybe are coming at it from a different angle, people we probably don't know. So it may be that we need to engage artists or work with one of the organizations that works with teens or preteens throughout the city. Again, I think it's partnerships and thinking about it in a way that's different from the way we think about it.
Terrific. What other questions are burning out there? We're curious also, what do you all want for Providence? Certainly the Providence Preservation Society is not, we don't set the agenda ourselves. We do hopefully more and more listening and want to advance the things that matter to the people who live here.
Yes, what do you want us to, how do you want PPS to work for Providence?
I have a question now. Well,
oh, good.
A lot of the preservation that was done was in lower income neighborhoods, was done on a broader level basis by nonprofit developers, One Only Builders, Neighborhood Builders, or the Elmwood Foundation, Gens. But what can we do to reach out to homeowners to not just, I don't want to sound elitist, I don't want to say educate, but to work to get, individual homes restored, brought up to standards? Do we need like community organizers working in the neighborhoods? Is that something to think about? I mean, we have money through the revolving fund, but how can we reach out, to people and get them interested?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you and I are both on the board of the revolving fund, and you're on our board as well. So we're all pretty cognizant of the need, being blinded here, with the need in housing. One thing that occurred to me is, often people in neighborhoods that are not already up to standards, preservation standards, but often they are, pretty well kept, and they may have other concerns about their house, such as lead in the water or lead paint. And, there are organizations that are doing work around promoting resources for those things. So maybe there's a way that we work with them to think about what other enhancements to the home could we bring, in addition to those things that address the health and safety of the people in the house. Because if you drive around some neighborhoods, like some in Washington Park, for instance, they're pretty intact architecturally, but there's a lot of vinyl siding, vinyl windows, which they don't meet preservation standards, but you can still read the neighborhood and you can see it's historic. So I don't know, there may be some avenues there if homeowners are interested in changing the look of their house. Perhaps maybe it's a block by block effort, or working with a neighborhood association. It's a good question. I think we really have to think about our goals though, like, what are we trying to accomplish?
As was pointed out by a few of our presenters, there is a real tension or divide between homeowners and renters. And oftentimes in a city, a good percentage of your population are renters. And so the messages of preservation, as they've been delivered for so long, are hard to win somebody over. If you're coming from take care of your home, historic properties are great, and you're just a person who, through a variety of circumstances, doesn't own property, doesn't stay in the same neighborhood, but should still have access to pride of place and many of the other messages that preservation sort of wraps itself around. How might we engage better with the folks in Providence who aren't historic homeowners? Something to think about.
Man, well, I do not have all the answers. That is a really good question. Does anybody else on the call have any ideas about how to engage with people who are not homeowners? Yeah, sorry,
got
Kelsey, you've got me stumped.
No, it's something to think about. I mean, I don't expect any of us to solve these questions right now, but we do have from our incoming board chair a suggested revised mission statement for consideration. He writes, inspired by Coop's work, places are history, history is power, we preserve places, as something to think about.
It's pretty thoughtful. He's a good wordsmith and designer.
And Sarah Zurier follows up, if you could rename Providence Preservation Society to reflect your new mission, be it that mission at Warren's suggestion or another, what would you call the organization?
Well, we only have one proposal so far, so I don't know. Maybe it's place preservers based on Warren's suggestion. I mean, I think the word preservation can be loaded. But also, when I've talked to people who are Latino, and I've asked them what's the Spanish word for preservation, and they say preservación, and I say, well, what does it mean? Basically, and they're like, basically means what you're saying. So, it's not that it may be loaded, but it also might not be loaded. So I'm not sure, I think sometimes it's easy to think, well, let's just get rid of that word. But I think English language is so complex, and every word can be loaded to someone. So I don't know what we would change it to. I mean, the other word that could be loaded is society. If it kind of exudes exclusivity, which we don't want it to, but the other thing it's about is being part of society. So I think it's not a bad word. It's just if our actions demonstrate exclusivity, then that's more of what it means. But if our actions that are talking about be part of the society that's working to make things better, then I think that's what it means. So I think it's less about the name and more about what we're doing. And so I think that's the way I would approach it.
All right, so maybe not a radical name change coming next year, but maybe
I'm
a more
open to
invigorating slate of activities.
Yeah.
I wanted to just reflect on that a moment, and in this era of maybe losing nouns, if I can generalize, I think we might even think of calling ourselves Providence Preservation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly around the country, organizations are dropping words from their names or rearranging the words. That's certainly something to think about. Good thing our consultant's on the call. She can help us think about that. I see Heather is talking about celebrating as a way to get people into preservation. I think that is an excellent suggestion because it's such a positive action, whereas advocacy can almost be about saying no to things, but celebration is about saying yes. And I think that's really important. I think celebrating should also be done when around more than just architecture, but around planning efforts. So if almost like even if you lose an advocacy issue, you should celebrate because all the work that goes into it should be celebrated, even if the outcome isn't. So we really need to celebrate both outcomes, but also actions a lot more.
And Mary points out, maybe it's not so much the name, the challenge is how we convey this new broader message through actions and otherwise.
That's so true. And one thing most nonprofits don't have enough of is funds for effective communications or communication staff. So Mary, you are hitting the nail on the head. And that's something that I've been talking with our board about quite a lot is we can't just change our mission statement and come up with new strategies and goals. We have to have a communications plan behind that. And our board is behind that very thing. We just got to figure out how to do it and not get distracted by all the other things that are happening around us. Because I think that's, with effective communications, we can engage a broader part of our city and our neighborhoods.
Any other questions percolating out there before we wrap this last session up? I don't want anybody to feel like they didn't get to say the thing that's been on their mind all week.
Well, I have a question. This is Maya.
Hi, Maya.
Hi, everybody. And Brent, if you and I have had this conversation offline on a number of occasions, and it seems to me, I was trying to compose it in the chat and it was just too wordy, so I'll just talk about it. It seems like the nonprofit community, I mean, everybody is the heightened awareness, heightened collective awareness around the issues of equity and justice, and whether it's climate or community or social, all of the above. We have a lot of really talented, creative nonprofit organizations in our city and in our state. And the power that all of those nonprofits could leverage into meaningful potential outcomes could be huge. And we compete with each other because we're all looking for donors and members and wanting our own spotlight to be shining, and that's okay. I mean, that's kind of the nature of the nonprofit world. But the times things are I'm just wondering if the exigency of our time could really kind of rewrite that narrative so that we as nonprofit leaders and board members and aren't so parochial, aren't so protective of our domains, and really try to make this a broader, more societal effort. And we're such a small state that I just feel like it shouldn't be that hard. And could PPS be the convener of that?
Well, yeah, of course, you're absolutely right. And I think we do collaborate a lot, but I hear what you're saying about making it more intentional in your foundational documents and the way you speak about your work. I think that's right on. Yeah. Now, of course, it relies on collaboration from other organizations, which I can only do so much.
I know, I understand that it's a tall order, but I'm, it's sort of like searching for our better angels across the board to try to solve some of these issues.
Right. Very true.
All right, we have a question here. Do you want to get to that, Brent?
Sure. I love that we're getting mostly references to Coop's talk, so thank you all for attending that. We will make videos available if you weren't able to attend. You can watch it later. So one part of the conversation Coop talked about was how to creatively export history when the physical buildings and spaces do not exist anymore. Yeah, that is a challenge. I've been working with Taylor Polites, who's a local historian and author. And he actually created a road tour, which is an app and website from the Council for the Humanities. So his road tour was about Pond Street. And Pond Street, there's one little tiny segment of Pond Street left behind the Catholic Cathedral downtown, but most of it was wiped out by the interstate and urban renewal. And so he does a great job of presenting that history. And he and I have been talking about how do we create some kind of physical representation of the place? Is it some kind of plaque? Is it an art installation? Is it a chalk outline showing where houses used to be? Things like that. That is somewhat outside what preservation organizations typically do, which is erect a bronze marker or a wooden house marker. And so I don't know. So that's a good question. So I think we have a really great house marker committee So do we expand that to think about markers more generally, or somehow recognition more generally, or is that a new organization? I don't know. Those are really excellent questions. How do we explore that history? Yeah, certainly apps and things like that. But I think part of it, the apps and websites are great if you know about them. But for instance, part of Taylor's tour involves a public housing project on Cranston Street. So what if you live there and you have no idea of the what was there at one time, the neighborhood? And so could that knowledge of that history connect you more strongly to the place that you currently live in? And I know there are very strong tenant associations in some of the public housing. And so, those are not necessarily transitory people. They're very much connected to where they live. And so I'd like to see us do something like that, where it's almost something you stumble across and not necessarily something you have to know about. So anyway, just some ideas.
And you spoke at the beginning,
Kelsey, I don't know,
about how, there are other fields that are doing this. Preservationists, the way our profession has formed is largely around the built environment, what physically exists, and saving the materials thereof, right? But there are plenty of other disciplines who are working with intangible heritage and documentary evidence that is not terribly sexy and needs, some humanization to be of interest to a broader public. And so it might just be about building those muscles ourselves and working with those who are already comfortable in that sort of work. And we do have many of those organizations already in Providence and Greater Rhode Island.
That's true. One of the conversations was around who decides what's worth saving. And I believe it was Claudia Guerra from San Antonio who mentioned the way they talk about cultural property, traditional cultural property. And one issue with the National Preservation Standards is that it does recognize tradition as sort of authority, but it's not as easy to use sort of oral tradition, things like that, to and to recognize places that don't necessarily have a physical manifestation. But I think you're right. I think of the Tamaqua Museum. Certainly, a lot of what they use is this traditional knowledge, cultural knowledge. And so they're one organization that I think of who is already doing that kind of work, not necessarily in Providence, but I think it would be interesting to build our muscles in those topical areas by working with organizations like that.
And you make a great point that we all have quite a bit of work to do in acknowledging that we are living and working and existing on Indigenous land. And we've done a very effective job at making sure there's very little tangible evidence of those people and cultures. So that's something that everybody needs to be doing a better job at, regardless whether you're a preservation organization or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Patricia Robb, one of our board members, mentions a project we did last year with artists highlighting places, neighborhoods, and sites that we don't normally focus on and where the histories may not be told as fully as they could. So that was a great project that we did, with 5 artists. And some of their work does live on our website. So that was a really, really wonderful effort. It didn't result in any physical reminders, or no markers were established. So that's something maybe we should think about next time. And then Mary is mentioning a mass MoCA plaque that uses verbatim quotes from oral histories. I actually love that idea. That's a really good idea. So we'll have to check those out.
All right, we have just a few minutes left in our program today. If you do have any final thoughts, we encourage you to share them now. Let me thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and to all of our attendees over the last 10 days. We've had about 450 folks join us across those 7 programs. Had some really terrific conversation. Thank you for supporting the Providence Preservation Society with your time and attention, as well as your dollars. Hopefully this has been a fruitful and rewarding experience for you as much as it has been for us. Again, we will not be ending the conversation here. This is work that is ongoing, and you can expect to see more of it in the coming year. And who knows, after we have a new mission and a new name, what kinds of things we'll be up to in the years ahead.
Yeah, and I just want to, before we close, Kelsey, I just want to say this is, see a lot of really engaged people, engaged with PPS in some ways. And so if you have other ideas on these things, or you want to get involved in helping shape new programs and activities, please let us know. We welcome your engagement.
All right, thank you, and enjoy.
So thanks for joining us, everybody.
Yeah, enjoy your weekend and have a safe and happy holiday.